David Maraniss, author of First in His Class. If you could have been with Bill Clinton at any time period in his life to see him up close, which one would you pick?
I would have picked his early childhood. It's probably the least known part of his life and the part I had the most frustration trying to recreate. Starting with his birth and up through probably his first 10 years, dealing first with a young man without a father and then an alcoholic stepfather. And although I've got a lot of people talking about that part of his life, I really don't know what it was like for young Bill Clinton to be in that household, and I'd really like to have watched that and how it affected him.
How did you try to find out what that period was like?
Well, I moved to Hope, Arkansas, where he was born, and spent a few weeks there interviewing dozens of people who knew the family. And I talked to a lot of his aunts and got a lot of the letters of that era and tried to recreate what it was like in that small town in the South during the late 1940s and early 1950s. And then I moved up to Hot Springs, where his stepfather was from, and stayed in the same hotel that Al Capone used to hang out in the Arlington Hotel up there, and tried to talk to as many women of his mother's generation, who many of whom also dealt with the same problems that she did in terms of being treated as equals with men and being abused by their husbands. So I spent a lot of time trying to recreate that generation.
How old was Bill Clinton in that picture I just showed?
He's only 4 years old in that picture.
What was life like for him in those early days in Hope?
Well, he was, essentially, he had two mothers. His own mother, Virginia, had left Hope when he was less than 2 to go down to New Orleans to study to be a nurse anesthetist. And so he lived with his Mama Cassidy, who was a very rigid character. And Bill Clinton is such a contrast of people. He has a certain discipline, and yet he's very undisciplined. His discipline comes from that grandmother who would wake him at a specific hour, whether he was ready to awake himself or not, and would feed him constantly on a pattern. And so he had two mothers, one mother who was sort of rebelling against the life and Hope and wanted to get away from it, and this grandmother who was teaching him the discipline of that time and place.
His grandmother, you write that she was a nurse.
Right.
But there was a relationship between her and her husband that was at times rocky or accusatory, that somebody was running around on the other person?
Many of their relatives told me the stories of how Mrs. Cassidy, Mama Cassidy, would scream and yell at her husband, Eldridge Cassidy, who was probably the best-liked man in Hope. He was the ice man at first. He'd deliver ice on a horse and wagon, and then eventually got a truck. But he was known as a very, very friendly man, and she thought he was too friendly with some of the women in town and would let him know.
Who's in this picture right here?
That is Virginia and her first husband, Bill Blythe, who is Bill Clinton's biological father, most likely.
Most likely?
Well, it's a very sensitive subject, but in the book, you'll notice that the time when Bill Blythe got out of the military in World War II does not quite correspond with the point where Virginia, Bill's mother, had always claimed that he got out of the military, and so there's some question about when Bill Clinton was conceived.
Was that information new?
Yes. I mean, I'd never heard it before. I'd heard it from people in Hope who would raise questions about it. And I'm not trying to disparage Bill Clinton's mother, but as a historian, I had to look into that. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to totally resolve it, but there are some discrepancies on the dates.
How many times had Bill Blythe been married?
He had been married at least 4 times before he met Virginia Cassidy. She knew about none of those marriages. It's possible that there are 1 or 2 others. It was hard for me to trace them all throughout the small courthouses of the South, but there are several others.
How many courthouses did you go to?
I went to 5. In Medill, Oklahoma, in Ardmore, Oklahoma, in Oklahoma City, in Sherman, Texas, and in Shreveport, Louisiana, and in Texarkana. Actually 6, I guess. I found 5.
And what were you looking for?
I was looking for W.J. Blythe. That's the way he was known. He was never Bill Blythe or William Jefferson Blythe until he met Virginia, Bill's mother. But I was looking for divorce and marriage records and birth records.
How many times had Bill Clinton's mother been married?
She had never been married before.
No, but when she died. How many times?
When she died, well, she married Bill Blythe, then she married Roger Clinton, then she married Jeff Dwyer, and then she married Kelly, Dick Kelly. So she'd been married to 4 men, but 5 times. She married Roger Clinton twice. Roger Clinton married Virginia when President Clinton was 4 years old, and they divorced when Bill Clinton was 14, 15, but only for 3 months. And then she felt sorry for him. She didn't love him anymore. He was an alcoholic who had abused her, and the divorce records are full of cases where one time he took her high heels and beat her on the head with the high heels. And he accused her of a lot of things which were untrue, and it was not a very comfortable marriage. But she remarried him after only 3 months of divorce because she felt sorry for him.
How much violence and alcoholism did President Clinton see as he was growing up?
That's one of the things I would like to know. I think he saw a lot, but that's why I said I would have liked to have been there during that era. That's not to say that every day in that household was a terror or that it was terrifying. And I know that from recreating Bill Clinton's life through his letters and conversations with so many of his friends, that it did not dominate the exterior of his life. His friends didn't even know that his stepfather was an alcoholic or abusing his mother. But I think that there were many occasions when it got pretty nasty inside that house. And I think that's what drove him in a lot of ways.
When did you first interview Bill Clinton?
I first interviewed him in January of December of 1991.
Did you interview him for this book?
I interviewed him 6 times in long interviews during the campaign. I wrote a number of longer stories about Bill Clinton and his life and career. The day I started writing the book, I contacted his press people and who all knew me and said I'm doing a biography. And from that day until the day the book was published, I tried to get interviews with him, and he denied all of my requests.
Were you ever told why?
Yes, I'm not always satisfied with the answers I got. I think that largely the reason why was that Bill Clinton is a person much more comfortable with the present and the future than with his own past. I was told, actually by Hillary, his wife, that their lawyers recommended against them talking to me. And I could only surmise that one of those reasons was monetary, that they thought it might affect their own future memoirs.
Now, you make a note in the preface here that both Mrs. Clinton and President Clinton declined to be interviewed for this book. Some White House aides, especially those attached to Hillary Clinton, were unhelpful. What did you mean by that?
I don't want to make too much of it, but generally speaking, scores of their closest friends cooperated with me to one degree or another. They all gave interviews. There were about 3 or 4 occasions where people who were in Hillary's part of the life called the White House, called Hillary's staff and said, should we talk to David Maraniss? And they were told no. And so I considered that unhelpful, that in fact they were trying to suppress interviews.
Again, do you know why?
I have no idea why in that case. The interviews that I was trying to get were not those that would be the most embarrassing in those cases. 2 of the interviews that people were told not to talk to me were her former ministers. A couple were roommates or friends from Wellesley College, her college years. Now there were several other people who said they were not eager to talk to me because why would I want to write a book about a sitting president? And so I went around and around with some people for a long time, but there were no indications that the White House was trying to talk them out of it. These were the only cases I found of that.
Why did you want to write a book about the sitting president?
Well, I thought it was a great story. That was really the underlying motivation, was that whatever anyone thinks of Bill Clinton's presidency or his ideology, that his life is a great American story, and it's a narrative that I thought revealed a lot about ambition, the clash between ambition and idealism, coming out of nowhere, that part of America, dealing with a troubled family, rising out of Arkansas from the point where he shook John Kennedy's hand in 1963 to actually living in the White House himself. I mean, that's just a great story. And the other thing that intrigued me was, I am of his generation. I'm 3 years younger than Bill Clinton. But I thought I saw him and Hillary as a means of writing a book about the post-war baby boom generation, using them as the main characters.
Let me ask you about this, things on this cover right here. Where's this picture from?
You know, I think that 9 out of 10 people would guess wrong about that picture. He looks maybe like he's somewhere between 18 and 22. In fact, he's 27. He's running for Congress in Fayetteville, Arkansas. He had just moved back from Yale Law School to be a assistant professor at the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville, 1974, running for Congress against John Paul Hammerschmidt. His first race there, which he did well in, but lost.
Why'd you pick this?
Well, we had a lot of pictures. Some are much more familiar to people. The picture of him at Oxford, a few other pictures that you would see and just know it's him and not think anything about it. I thought that picture was unfamiliar to people, and it has a certain allure to it. I think it's an intriguing picture that grabs you and shows that there is more behind this man than you might think, good and bad. That it's not something that you just see and say, oh, I know that.
Where'd you find it?
It was taken by a photographer for the paper up in Springdale, Arkansas, and I had accumulated hundreds of pictures while I was doing the book.
It says at the top, a biography of Bill Clinton, first in his class. Where'd you get the name?
It just sort of came out of a few discussions between my editor, Alice Mayhew, and myself about, we knew that it had to have first in it, and it doesn't reflect, he was never first in his class academically, but he was close. He was fifth in his high school class. He was Phi Beta Kappa at Georgetown. At Oxford, he never got a degree, and at Yale Law School, he graduated, got the law degree, but he was never in class. But first in his class means that he's the first member of his generation to become president.
And besides your name, it's below, it says winner of the Pulitzer Prize. What did you win that for?
I won that for my stories on Bill Clinton during the 1992 campaign. They were not campaign stories per se, they were stories about his life and career. I think that I probably wrote about 25 larger stories about him, and 10 were nominated for the Pulitzer Prize.
Now, your name, David Maraniss, as you know, it's mispronounced a lot.
Maraniss, yeah.
What's the origin? Where's the name come from?
That's a great question. Maraniss comes from Marano, which is a word that was given to Spanish Jews during the Inquisition, conversos. My father is from a Jewish family. He's not a practicing Jew. And my mother's Scotch-Irish. And Marano, we're the only Marinisses in the country. My brother and my father and my son and my brother's
In the
sons.
country?
Yeah.
Where's home then?
Oh, I don't know where home is anymore. My father lives, my parents live in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. And I've lived in Washington. I've worked for the Washington Post since 1977, but 8 of those years I was in Austin, Texas, as their Southwest Bureau Chief, and that's where my 2 children went through high school, so they think of Austin as home, and I think of Madison as home. My wife is from Madison, too, so we're sort of from all over.
Where'd you go to school?
To the University of Wisconsin.
And how did back to your parents, how did they meet originally?
My parents met at the University of Michigan. My dad grew up in Coney Island, Brooklyn, New York, and he got a baseball scholarship to the University of Michigan in the late 1930s. And my mother was a townie. She grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and was a freshman when he was a senior. He was the editor, one of the editors of the Michigan Daily, and that's how they met.
Let me ask you about a it's hard to know, there's so much in the book, where to start with all the years and all that. But I want to ask you about some people.
Sure.
One name that comes up near the end of the book a lot is Richard Morris. Who is he?
He is a largely unknown character in modern American politics. He's a consultant who works out of Connecticut and New York City. He is a Machiavellian, fascinating character who knows how to connect with politicians in a way that few other consultants do, but yet there's a certain embarrassment about him because he is so clearly Machiavellian that the politicians for whom he gives advice often don't want the public or the rest of the press to know that he's doing it. He started advising Bill Clinton when Clinton first ran for governor in 1978, and he was, along with Hillary and one other person, Betsy Wright, Clinton's key advisor throughout his entire governorship era in Arkansas, and yet no one, when I went through the clips of the papers in Arkansas, his name was never there. But he is the one who gave Clinton most of the key advice during his comeback after he'd lost the governorship in 1980 when he came back, and advised him all the way up until the point where Morris was basically, I don't know, he was almost apolitical but moderate to conservative, and eventually started advising only Republican candidates except for Bill Clinton. And finally, I think it was the Republican National Chairman who said, look, Morris, you got to give it up. You can't keep advising Clinton. He might want to run for president. And so Morris had to drop Clinton too, but I think he's still advising them.
Have you ever, you obviously interviewed him because I...
Several times, on the record.
Was he reluctant to be interviewed, or was he...
He had not been interviewed before, but I think that he knew I was writing a serious historical biography, and he wanted his role to be there for history, I think.
How many interviews did you do for the book?
Well, I say I did 400. I think that when I've gone through my notes again, it's more than that, maybe 450. Some people I interviewed many, many times, and some just once.
Anybody besides the President and Mrs. Clinton just flat out say they wouldn't talk to you?
Yes. One of Clinton's college girlfriends, who's in the book, Ann Markison, would not talk to me, flat out. I tried for a year and a half. Two of the troopers who talked to the American Spectator would not talk to me.
They say why?
I think that they were more comfortable dealing with some of the other people that they had arrangements with.
Back to Richard Morris. I noticed, and I made a note of it on page 455. You write this: Cabe stood by. Clinton suddenly lost control, according to Cabe, and slugged Morris, sending him reeling. Clinton apologized. Cabe later recalled, but he was still, I won't use the language, ticked off is the expression. Morris did not resign. He stayed on for the rest of the campaign, though every now and then, according to Cabe, he would mutter, "I can't believe Clinton hit me."
You know, most of Clinton's, the people who had covered Clinton over the years in Arkansas, everybody knew he had a temper, but no one knew he'd ever hit anyone before. To get that anecdote, Richard Morris wouldn't confirm or deny it, but I already knew it to be true, and Gloria Cabe confirmed it for me.
Who's Gloria Cabe?
She was Clinton's campaign manager during that 1990 campaign, an Arkansas woman who had been in the state legislature there and had known Bill Clinton since the beginning of his political career. I don't even think Morris would dispute the fact that probably there are dozens of politicians around the country who, when they read that anecdote, sort of smiled and said, good for Clinton, because Morris has a way of getting under people's skin and driving them crazy. He knows that.
What about Morris, Richard Morris, and his advice to the current president when he was running for governor? You talk about something called the permanent campaign.
Well, Morris's advice was often very astute, and that's why Clinton, and even more so Hillary Rodham Clinton, really relied on Morris. Morris is the one who told Clinton to apologize to the people of Arkansas for his first term, which proved to be very effective, saying that he understood that he'd made mistakes, and almost like the prodigal son saying, you know, let me back, and it worked very effectively, and it was a technique sort of humble admission that Clinton and Hillary remembered for the future and used again and again over the years.
When did this happen?
That happened in 1980, 81, when he was preparing to run again in 82. They taped a TV spot where Clinton essentially said, "I'm sorry, I learned my lessons, it'll never happen again." At that point, Clinton was the youngest ex-governor in American history. He was really depressed and fit the ironic description of the Rhodes Scholar, which is a bright young man with a great future behind him. And Morris really pulled him out of it and told him, apologize, go forward, and it worked. And then he developed what I call the permanent campaign, which was essentially to go around the established media, the newspapers and television, and as you're pushing a legislative agenda, use your own public relations apparatus to sell your agenda. It's something that Clinton did from then on. To use polling constantly, not just to find out what the people were thinking about an issue, but how they would respond specifically to rhetoric. Clinton loved that. It isn't just pure Machiavellian. Clinton really did love to connect with people, he always had, and to have a scientific way of doing it really intrigued him, and he did that for the rest of his career as well.
How did they find Dick Morris in the first place?
I think Morris found them. It was 1978, and Clinton was he was Attorney General of Arkansas, and he was preparing to run for governor. And Morris was really starting out in his career and was very aggressively pursuing candidates around the country. And Clinton was one of those that he latched on with. But he drove Clinton's other aides crazy during that first campaign, and they essentially fired him until Clinton was defeated as governor after only 2 years, and then Hillary really called and said, "Come on back, we need you again." And he stayed on for the rest of the 80s.
The names Carville and Begala and Grunwald are not in this book.
No, there are very few people from the 90s. Well, the book ends the day Clinton announced for president. He had certainly met Carville and Begala by then, but they are not what this book is about. This book is not about the 1992 campaign, and it's not about Bill Clinton as president, although I would argue that although the book ends the day he announced for president, everything that happened since is in the book, because his campaign, in essence, was his life coming back to him, and his presidency, the first 2 years, have largely been recurring patterns of his career coming back to him.
Betsy Wright was also a part of the permanent campaign. You said Hillary Clinton, Bill
Yes.
Clinton,
Betsy
Dick Morris,
Wright.
and Betsy Wright.
Betsy Wright came down to Little Rock about a week or two after Bill Clinton was defeated in 1980. And she lived in the governor's mansion for a while, sort of piecing back together all of the detritus of his life, of his political career. She put into computers all of the thousands of note cards that he had of his key political allies and contributors. And then when he won re-election, she became his chief of staff from 1983 through 1990. And her relationship with Clinton is one of the most interesting that I encountered. There's a real sisterly, brotherly, love-hate relationship going on there all through their time together. And so she is both fiercely loyal to him and yet is angry at him all the time.
Is she angry at you?
I don't think she is. When the book you're referring to, when the book came out, there's a scene in the book where Betsy Wright and Bill Clinton meet at her house, and they go over a list of women who might be problematic for him if he were to run for president in 1988. And when the book came out, she issued what I would call a non-denial denial, saying that David Maraniss might have misrepresented or misinterpreted what I had told him, but I hadn't. She knows I didn't. It's very clear to me and my editors at the Washington Post that for 2 weeks before that incident that I was talking to her. I'd read to her all of the parts of the book that referred to that. We have documents about it. So I don't think she's mad. I think she was under a little bit of pressure to try to deny it, but no one has said a word about it since or challenged any of the other parts of the book.
Why did she, and I counted 3 interviews that you listed in the back with her, is that right?
Well, there are 3 major interviews. I talked to her many other times, but 3 long interviews.
It might be useful before we go any farther, and I'll get to I want to show the audience how you did this. I don't know that I've ever seen it done quite this way, but what you see here are notes, and every page in which you have an interview with someone that you refer to, it's listed next to the page number here. Where did you get that idea?
I followed the pattern that Taylor Branch used in Parting the Waters, a book about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. Taylor Branch is one of my heroes as a writer, and he also had the same editor. And so when I was looking for a way to do my source notes, I thought that would be a good pattern to follow.
And when you interviewed people, and you list the date in here, do you have tapes to back it up? How did you do that?
Well, some are tape recorded and some aren't, but I certainly have the notes. I'll be better organized for my next book, but as my researchers will attest, it's all there in files and in notes, and it took me a long time to do those chapter notes at the end when I was done with the book.
When was the last word written?
September 24th, 1994.
And as I remember, you even have an interview that you did on September the 24th. There was at least the
close
22nd. I have Cliff Jackson on September the 22nd, 1994.
Yeah, I was writing the final scene, and the final scene of the book is what a lot of people who appear in different parts of the book were doing while Bill Clinton was announcing for president. And I just, at the last minute, I mean, you know, there are things that hit me now after the book is done, but at the last minute I thought I should call him one more time and say, what were you doing? And it turned out that he was at home watching it on TV, and it added a certain texture to that final scene.
Who's Cliff Jackson?
Cliff Jackson is another Arkansan of Bill Clinton's generation who was at Oxford for 1 year when Bill Clinton was there. And according to Jackson, Clinton sort of manipulated or used him to help get out of the draft. Jackson was as ambitious as Clinton at that period. There was a little bit of jealousy going on, and that he saw that Clinton had a few characteristics that Jackson lacked in terms of being gregarious and getting along with people, and that Clinton would succeed perhaps where Jackson wouldn't. They both went back to Arkansas. Clinton rose to power, and Jackson was always in the background, almost in a Shakespearean way, thinking that he was going to get this guy sooner or later. And during the campaign, he went after Clinton.
More than once in the book, I would come across you writing, this is the myth, but this isn't the way it happened. I'll give you an example. This is a small example, but the story about how Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton met. You say that Bob Reich, the Secretary of Labor, who was a friend of his, actually introduced the two of them before they met in the library, or whatever that story is.
Yeah.
How often did you find that the story that's being told about his life is not accurate according to what you described?
Well, I found it at almost every era of his life there was at least one story that had become mythologized. Sometimes it's totally innocuous, and it's just probably bad memories. I mean, they might not have remembered that Reich introduced him, and the other story is more colorful. Sometimes there was a definite psychological or political reason for the mythologizing. For instance, another one of the myths that Bill Clinton would tell was about how he sort of accidentally got his job as a professor at the University of Arkansas. He says he was just driving back from Yale Law School and stopped at the side of the road on the interstate and called the dean and got the job. And in fact, he had tried to get the job for many months and had gone through the normal patterns of using friends and contacts to get that job. And I think that that myth was established by Clinton so that, because he was going back to a place that all of his Yale Law School friends thought he was crazy to go to. And so I think it was sort of like, well, it was just easy. It was an accident. I didn't have to try to do it. And the other reason was that he knew in his mind he was going back to run for Congress. And so the idea that he would work so hard to get hired as a professor, when in fact he had really no much interest in being a professor, that's why he would create this myth of it was just sort of a fluke.
You also say that one of the organizations that he fought hardest against, or not against them, but they had the biggest conflict with, which surprises you when you read it compared to what's going on today, was the Arkansas Educational Association, back in the days when he was running for governor and was governor.
Yeah.
Why was he having a fight with the teachers of Arkansas?
Well, it does seem odd because he's always considered himself an education politician, and he had, you know, he has so many degrees himself. But in fact, he was under court pressure to reform the education system in Arkansas. And to get the money that he needed, he realized through polls that Dick Morris did and through discussions with the major business leaders in Arkansas who would help fund his education reform effort, that he had to make the teachers accountable in some dramatic, clear way. And so he imposed teacher tests, competence tests on the teachers. And they hated it. But the public loved it. And it helped Clinton politically very much to use the teachers as sort of a fake enemy. I mean, you know, it was just, he just set himself up in opposition to them in order to help himself politically and to get across this broader program of which he thought it had a lot of merit. I don't think he ever really wanted to use the teachers in that way, but they were just convenient for him. And so for about 6 years of his governorship, he and the teachers were at odds. And yet, when I was covering the campaign in 1992 and went up to New Hampshire, there standing next to me was the former head of the teachers union who used to denounce him all the time, campaigning for him. He has a way of winning people over again.
You wrote this, you said that Clinton perpetuated the myth that his life progressed in a series of accidents and uncalculated events. Clinton perpetuated the myth that his life progressed in a series of accidents and uncalculated events.
Well, I think that the Yale Law School to Arkansas is one part of that. I think his whole life has a measure of calculation in it, which he's tried to diminish because, for a lot of reasons, one of which is that political ambition, raw political ambition in America is often seen as a bad thing. You would never say that about someone who wanted to grow up and become the best ice skater in the world or the best pianist, but if you want to be president from an early age, people see that as a negative. And so he always wanted to couch that, even though he had that burning desire in him. And so part of the way to temper that is to make it look like a lot of these things happened by accident. But as the prologue in my book is his handshake with John Kennedy, 1963, the iconic transfer of ambition from a president to a future president. And as my prologue shows so clearly, that was no accident, that handshake, that it was the one on the bus ride down who kept asking the chaperone whether they could get their pictures taken, and once the bus got to the White House, he race-walked his way to the best position in line to get the handshake. So there is always that calculation.
How were you able to reconstruct 30 years later the handshake in the Rose Garden?
That was a lot of fun. I got a list of every boy senator to Boys Nation that year, from Judge Orson Johnson down in Alabama, who was one of the boys and had tried to have a reunion of sorts. And so I befriended him and talked to him, and he gave me the list of all of the other boys. And I found the head of the program, Mr. O'Connor, was a retired lawyer in New York City. Another of the American Legion guys was from Madison, Wisconsin, my hometown. I found him, and he had a lot of pictures and an archive full of the documents, so I could recreate what happened every day and jog the memories of the boys, or the men now, that I interviewed for that. So I talked to a lot of them and recreated it that way, including the other senator from Arkansas, Larry Taunton, who's now a businessman in suburban Dallas. And he was the closest physically to Clinton during that whole week, so he was very helpful.
I tried to write down as many as I could, where you say that Clinton perpetuated the myth that his life progressed in a series of accidents and uncalculated events. One of them was that he rose from poverty. Did he?
Not really. His grandparents didn't have a lot of money, but they weren't poor by Hope standards. They certainly weren't rich. But his grandfather never cared about money, but he did run a store, and they lived in a nice White House, so I wouldn't say that's poverty. Roger Clinton, his stepfather, was terrible with money and was always losing it or wasting it on alcohol and women and gambling. But Roger Clinton's brother, Raymond Clinton, was a wealthy auto dealer in Hot Springs and belonged to a country club, and young Bill Clinton had a car in high school and played golf at a country club. So I wouldn't say that that's poverty. I think there's a little bit of myth there.
The other one, this is a small one, but that you say that they kept talking, when he went to Oxford, that he was a part of the PPE program,
Yeah.
but in fact he
wasn't. I couldn't figure out why he ever kept telling that story, because...
Well, what is PPE?
It's politics, philosophy, and economics. Oxford has a lot of coursework that's unfamiliar to American college students. I mean, the way they define it, but that's a course of study, which would have been essentially an undergraduate's course of study that a lot of Rhodes Scholars took, including Bob Reich, but Clinton did not. And why he said he did, I couldn't figure out, but when I went to Oxford and interviewed some of the dons and professors who had worked with him there, they went through the records and said no. That in fact he was in a different course of study, which required one long paper at the end of the 2 years.
Odds and ends that I'd never seen before. Jerry Brown offered him a job.
I got that one late in my reporting from Mickey Cantor, the trade rep, who was from Cantor's from California and knew Jerry Brown and Bill Clinton, and I was interviewing about another part of their lives together, and he described for me how Clinton asked him whether he should go work for Jerry Brown after Clinton was defeated in 1980 as the chief of staff.
After being governor.
After being governor. Yeah, it was sort of like, well, Jerry Brown, you know, just come out to California, that's where you belong, I'll give you a job out here. But Clinton turned it down.
You say that when he was at Yale in law school, that he used to sit with the black students at their table. What was the significance of that?
Well, it was at a time of black power, black separation to a certain degree, or at least a cultural identity that separated the races in college campuses. And Clinton's friends, his roommates, all told me they were afraid to go sit at that table. Even though they were perhaps further to the left politically than Bill Clinton, they said they just felt uncomfortable being over there, and it was clear to them that the black students didn't want them to be there. And Clinton just sort of barged his way into the table and would tell jokes about himself, self-deprecating jokes, jokes about the South, jokes about sex, jokes about anything, and really was very comfortable in that milieu. Just a natural thing that he had. He's very good at adapting to different cultures and milieus, and is particularly good at connecting with black people on that level. And almost every black that I interviewed for the book told me that in one way or another.
Let me ask you about some other people that you wrote about. Strobe Talbot.
Talbot was the quintessential Rhodes Scholar. He's probably what you would think of in your mind when you think of one. He was a Yalie who told me that he would sing the Whip and Poof song in the shower, and he was the son of an establishment figure in suburban Cleveland, Ohio. Very serious young man who studied Russian poetry and Russian politics in college and then at Oxford, and turned against the war when he was at Yale, and actually gave a commencement speech at Yale right before they went off to Oxford against the war, and explaining how even those young men who didn't go off to fight nonetheless were victims of the war, or veterans of it in one sense or another. James Reston, the New York Times columnist, went up to Yale that year of Talbot's senior year at Yale and wrote a column saying that if the good young men of the establishment like Strobe Talbot were against the war in Vietnam, then Johnson was really in trouble. At Oxford, Talbot was a more serious student than Clinton was, but they lived together in their second year over there at a time when Clinton was really out of sorts, and their third roommate was Frank Aller.
Who's also in this picture.
Who's also in that picture and was from Washington State, and he was a China scholar. And he was the only one of the 32 Rhodes Scholars from their class who resisted the draft. He was inducted and refused to go, and he stayed over in England as a resistor. Finally came back to the United States a couple of years later, and in fact, it was at a period where he had lost some of the martyrdom that he had at England, and he ended up committing suicide.
You mentioned that Bill Clinton was out of sorts his second year or first year in Oxford. What was the problem?
Yeah, the draft, largely. He went over, like about half of the 32 Rhodes Scholars went over to England the first year with sort of unofficial but clear deferments that they didn't deserve. Johnson had just eliminated graduate school deferments, but most of the local draft boards considered these guys local heroes. And they didn't want them to get drafted right when they'd won this great prestigious honor. So they went over to England with deferments that they didn't really deserve. And in the spring, eventually, finally, of his first year, Clinton got his draft notice. And he came back to Arkansas that summer of 1969 in agony, trying to figure out what to do. He didn't want to fight in Vietnam. He was against the war. Who knows whether he's afraid of dying, but I think most young men are. And, I mean, there was a whole mixture of feelings that he was going through. He wanted to be in politics. He believed in the established way. So he's trying to figure it out, and he eventually manipulated his way into an ROTC post that he never served in, and went back to England feeling guilty about that. And that's when he was living with Talbot and Aller, that second year after he got back.
Watermelons. You refer enough times to the watermelon.
The watermelons of Hope, Arkansas. You know, I was in Hope for a long time, but I never saw those big watermelons. I was there the wrong time of the year. But there were several years when the Guinness Book of Records listed a watermelon from Hope, Arkansas as the largest in the world. And I talked to some old-timers there who used to describe how the railroads would come through Hope in southwest Arkansas and stop there. And the conductors would the porters would get out, and there'd be fresh watermelons cut on these trays outside the train, and they'd bring them back, and the people would eat them on their way down to Texas.
Did Bill Clinton, I mean, you mentioned that he would bring this up a lot, the watermelons.
It was a way for Bill Clinton to talk about he was from a place other than where his friends were from. I mean, because he left Arkansas when he was 17 years old, went to the East Coast, and was away for 9 years. And he was dealing with a totally different culture. He was the Southern Baptist from the South at Georgetown, full of upper-middle-class Catholic kids from the East Coast, and the sons and daughters of presidents of El Salvador and Saudi Arabia and the Philippines were in his class. And unlike so many of the kids of that era who would try to forget their past, shed their past, Clinton, I think, used that past as almost a defense mechanism. So rather than being embarrassed about coming from the small town, he played it up. And one way he did was by constantly talking about the watermelons.
Who do you think had the biggest influence on him as a person?
His mother.
Besides her? You mentioned ministers, teachers, coaches.
Yeah, I think that, well, besides his mother and his wife, okay, he was in constant search of father figures. He never had that father. And I think that later in his life, it was his minister in Little Rock,
Name?
W.O. Vaught, who was as unlike Bill Clinton as anyone could be in the world. He was a short, wiry, bespectacled, rigid man who taught only from Scripture, was very conservative in his political beliefs, but ran the largest Southern Baptist church in Arkansas. And Bill Clinton took to Vaught and really looked to him for not only spiritual help, but political advice. Vaught helped him work out his positions on abortion and the death penalty. But Vaught died before Clinton ran for president. I think he missed him a lot during that tumultuous era.
Who's Virgil Sperling?
Virgil Sperling was an earlier version of Vaught, in a sense. He was Bill Clinton's band director at Hot Springs High School. Also a very conservative Southern Baptist, former military guy, who Bill Clinton revered, was probably a little afraid of, and maybe with his friends away from Sperling would even make fun of. But in essence, he revered Sperling, and Sperling was a great organizer. the band festivals for the whole state of Arkansas were held in Hot Springs every spring, and Sperlin would have to organize this massive contest, almost like an NCAA basketball tournament, where you'd have people competing at different instruments for a week long, and they had to figure out who would compete where and for how long and when they would be there. And Bill Clinton helped him set up these charts that would organize like 3,000 musicians and when they would be where. And I think that it was the first political organizing skill that Clinton learned from band and from Virgil Sperlin.
Picture here of Mrs. Clinton in at another time,
yeah,
and Bill Clinton's mother.
And his brother Roger. That's 1979 when he was inaugurated as the youngest governor in America since Harold Stassen. He was then 32.
What's the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Clinton?
It's always changing. I think that that it was built on a shared passion for policy and politics and books and ideas and intellectual life, and also a sense of humor. I think that when he married Hillary, he told his friends that he was going for brains over glamour. I think that she knew what she was getting into when she married him, in the sense of his enormous appetite for life. And it's had several tumultuous parts to their marriage, but it's a pragmatic political partnership with some extra spice to it as well.
You report that she was in a role similar to her healthcare role as First Lady in Arkansas.
Yeah, I think to understand their relationship now, you have to understand it's gone through 3 stages, basically. They met at Yale Law School, and from that point in the early 1970s until 1980, when he was defeated as governor, I think that although they saw they could get to their ultimate goal together, they were really leading independent lives, in the sense that she was building up her own life and career as first a law professor, then as a lawyer, and working in Children's Defense Fund issues. And then he got beat, and she came to the realization that he could only recover with her more profound help. And from then on, she was his key financial person, his key political advisor, his pro bono lawyer on ethical issues, and his main policy person. And she was the head of the task force on education reform, which was successful and which made his name in Arkansas and established his career for the 1980s and helped him become a national figure. They carried that policy partnership into the White House almost without even thinking twice about it. And so then when the health care plan was defeated, it forced them to actually reconsider whether she should be in that out front policy role. And I think they're reworking that right now.
Go back, though, to 1988, and you paint I think it was 88, a picture of when, no, I guess it was his decision on whether to run for governor again, 1990.
1990.
And you paint a picture of no one knowing until actually minutes before, or even maybe as he made the announcement in 1990, whether he was going to run again for Arkansas governor, including his wife. Is that new? Did you? Well,
I think that the detail is new, but people in Arkansas who covered that race were trying to figure it out as well, you know. But it was stunning to me that one of Hillary's friends called her and said, "Do you know what Bill's going to do?" I mean, here she is, his main political advisor, and yet there was just enormous uncertainty on whether he would run again that year. And maybe that was a period when they weren't as close as some other periods. I think that that's true, that they were a little bit apart then, not separated, but not as close as they were in other eras.
Did he tell the people of Arkansas that if he ran and won, he would not?
He told the people when he ran for governor in 1990 that if he were elected, he'd serve out 4 years. Someone asked him that question at a political forum: will you serve out your term if you're elected? And in classic Clinton style, without even thinking, he said, "You bet," just like that. And then he had to live with those 2 words and break them.
But and we've had other politicians do the same thing.
Sure.
It doesn't seem to matter, though. I mean, what did he get 58% of the vote in the state of Arkansas when he ran for president?
Yeah.
So, do you have any idea why people are willing just to let that go?
Well, there's a joke in Arkansas that they voted for him to get rid of him. But I mean, that's not it, obviously, with most of them. But I think that Clinton is always asking for forgiveness of one sort or another, and people in Arkansas are often willing to give it to him. And they knew all along that his goal was to be president. By the time he made that decision, people in Arkansas knew him so well that those who were for him no matter what, and those who were against him hated his guts and didn't care. And so there were no undecideds about Bill Clinton in Arkansas by that time. They'd known him for so long.
From the time you started focusing on this book and the time you finished, how long was it?
I started the book the day after the election. And even though I'd spent a year before that covering him, I said to myself, I'm starting over from scratch. And I tried to as much as possible. And then from that moment until September 24th, 1994, almost 2 years.
How did you work? Where were you?
Well, when I started the book, I was still in Austin, Texas as the Southwest Bureau Chief for the Post, but I got a leave of absence. I was living in Austin, closer to Arkansas, so I spent an awful lot of time in Little Rock, Fayetteville, Hot Springs, and Hope, the 4 Arkansas towns of Bill Clinton's life, moving from one to the other for a few weeks at a time, gathering as much research as I could. I went to Oxford for a long time with my wife and went over everything I could in his life overseas. And I traveled to Washington a lot and to as many places as I had to find the people from his life.
Let me ask you just one quick question because it makes a connection. Alan Ryan, a professor from Princeton, was here a couple of months ago to talk about Tocqueville. I read in this book that you did an interview with Alan Ryan and that he was
he was at Oxford then.
He was his teacher?
Right.
Does he remember him?
Barely, vaguely. He remembers that Ryan was teaching this special class for people who had to make up things, or sort of a cram course for before you write your final exams. And Clinton was in that class. Ryan remembers more clearly Clinton's girlfriend, but he thinks he remembers Clinton too. Yeah, I mean, the coincidence, I mean, I could spend literally the rest of my life interviewing people who knew Bill Clinton and who knew him with an anecdote to tell or something where their lives intersected forever. I mean, so I interviewed more than 400 people, and I know there's so much more out there. He's a man whose life, I mean, he spent his whole life networking and running into people, and I still find people today saying, well, did you know this about, I knew him in this year, did you know, and I'll never know it all.
I've heard somewhere that he's been reading this book, and
he's read the whole thing now.
Did you get any feedback on what he thought?
I haven't gotten it directly. Most of the people in the book who are very close to him have read the book and have called me or written me letters saying that they think it's a fair, accurate book and they really like it. Clinton obviously can't say that because half the book is critical of him, so he's sort of reading it aloud, an abridged version of stories that are neutral or that are just funny, you know, and he enjoys all of that part of the book. He's a very sensitive person who will argue or debate any anecdote in there or story in which he doesn't come out in the best light. But just the other night I encountered George Stephanopoulos and Mark Guerin, and they both thought the book was great, and they're 2 of his top aides.
Now, if you're a Republican running for president and you read this book, what would you conclude about 1996? Well,
see, that's the other irony of this book, or actually something that makes me feel good, is that, I mean, Robert Novak, you know, a leading conservative in a column this morning was praising the book. There's something in there for everybody. There's certainly a lot of material for Clinton's enemies as well as his friends. And I think they can find parts of his life where he was duplicitous, where he where he manipulated his way out of things and didn't tell the truth about them later. And there are parts of the book where you can see that he's a caring, compassionate, interesting person.
What do you think he believes the strongest about?
Well, you know, that's the #1 question about Bill Clinton. And in the last month, as I've been on the book tour, that's the question that people call into radio shows about the most. What does this guy really believe the most? I mean, in a general way, I can say that I think he went into politics to do good, and that his life and career has been that clash between idealism and ambition. If you're looking at one issue, I think as a progressive coming out of the South, that race relations always meant the most to him. It was the burning issue of his childhood and youth, and that Vietnam really, in a sense, got in the way of what he wanted to do in terms of his political career and civil rights. And then, again, so did his ambition. And so there are 2 or 3 points in his career where you can see him making decisions on issues relating to civil rights that are controversial.
What are you going to do next?
Well, I've worked for the Washington Post for 18 years, and it's a great institution that gave me a sabbatical to do this book, so I owe them. I'm writing a series right now on the new Republican Congress, or trying to work on it as much as I can while I'm talking about this book. And then but I loved writing this book, and I really would like to write books for the rest of my life. Maybe one on Vince Lombardi. I'm from Wisconsin. I think a cultural biography of him would be fascinating.
What was the hardest thing to do with this book? And we're about out of time.
The hardest thing was to decide in my own mind what I felt about this guy. I'd go back and forth violently, because there are chapters in his life where I liked him and chapters where I didn't. And so I would beat myself up saying, make up your mind, you've got to decide. And then I realized that he is a dual person and that I had it right.
David Maraniss, author of First in His Class, thank you.
Great, thank you, Brian.